February 9, 1944, Philippine Sea, 147 meters beneath the surface. Comfort 23 hours. The hull of the I-176 creaked under the pressure of the deep water, each groan of stressed steel a reminder that only centimeters of metal separated Lieutenant Commander Kusaka Tanami and his crew from the crushing weight of the ocean. The submarine had been submerged for 11 hours, running silent through waters that Imperial Japanese Navy charts indicated should be safe, far from known American patrol routes, deep enough to avoid surface detection, moving slowly to minimize the acoustic signature that might betray their presence. Inside the pressure hull, the air had grown thick and stale, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, diesel oil, and the sour metallic tang of the carbon dioxide scrubbers working overtime to keep the atmosphere breathable. Kusaka stood in the cramped control room, one hand gripping an overhead pipe to steady himself against the gentle roll of the submarine. He had commanded the I-176 for 9 months, long enough to know every sound his boat made, every vibration that traveled through the hull. He could distinguish the normal operational noises, the hum of electric motors, the gurgle of water through the ballast system, the rhythmic ping of the depth gauge, from the anomalies that signaled danger. His sonar operator, Petty Officer Nakamura, sat hunched over his equipment in the tiny sound room adjacent to the control space, headphones pressed against his ears, eyes closed in concentration as he listened to the acoustic landscape of the ocean. At 04:27, Nakamura's eyes snapped open. His hand shot up, signaling for silence. Kusaka felt his chest tighten. In the confines of a submarine running submerged, any unexpected sound could mean death. A destroyer's propellers signaling an imminent depth charge attack, the high-frequency ping of active sonar searching for targets, the mechanical sounds of torpedoes in the water. The crew froze, breath held, waiting. Nakamura removed one earphone and turned to face his commander. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence it carried clearly. "Strange sound, sir. Bearing 270, not a ship, not biological. Something artificial, persistent. I've never heard anything like it before." Kusaka moved to the sound room and took the headphones. Through them, he heard what Nakamura described, a regular electronic pulse, not the sweeping beam of active sonar, but something different, a transmission, a beacon. It repeated at precise intervals, each pulse identical to the last, carrying through the water with a clarity that suggested sophisticated hydrophone technology. The sound had a mechanical quality, inhuman and relentless, like the heartbeat of some vast machine. "Distance?" Kusaka asked. "Difficult to determine, sir. The signal is clear, but the source, it's not moving. It's fixed in position, transmitting continuously." A fixed underwater transmitter in the middle of the Philippine Sea, hundreds of kilometers from any known American base. Kusaka felt something cold settle in his stomach. The Americans were doing something new again, something Japanese naval intelligence had not briefed them about, something that transformed the ocean in ways he did not yet understand. He ordered the submarine to alter course, to investigate at safe distance while maintaining depth. As the I-176 turned toward the bearing Nakamura had identified, more signals emerged from the hydrophone array, not just one transmitter, but dozens, perhaps hundreds. They formed a pattern across the seafloor, an electronic grid broadcasting into the darkness. In that moment, listening to those persistent mechanical pulses, Kusaka understood that the ocean had changed. The vast Pacific that had seemed so empty, so neutral, so much the natural domain of submarines that could move unseen through its depths, was no longer empty at all. The Americans had filled it with electronic eyes and ears. They had claimed it, marked it, made it their territory, in ways that no navy in history had ever managed. The submarine that Kusaka had believed was hidden in the anonymous deep was instead moving through a space that the enemy could see, could map, could control. The fear that gripped him then was not the immediate terror of depth charges or torpedoes, though those would come soon enough. It was the deeper, more existential dread of realizing that the fundamental assumptions underlying Japanese submarine warfare had become obsolete. The ocean was no longer neutral ground. It belonged to America now. The Japanese submarine force that entered the Pacific War in December 1941 represented one of the most sophisticated underwater fleets ever assembled. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested heavily in submarine technology throughout the 1930s, developing vessels that were larger, faster, and longer range than most American or European designs. Submarines like the I-176, a Kaidai-class boat displacing 1,630 tons surfaced, could travel over 10,000 nautical miles without refueling, allowing them to operate across the entire Pacific theater. They were equipped with powerful 140mm deck guns, carried the deadly Type 95 torpedo with its oxygen-fueled propulsion system that left no wake, and were manned by crews who had trained intensively for years in peacetime exercises. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized offensive operations against enemy warships rather than merchant shipping. The submarines were conceived as fleet auxiliaries designed to scout ahead of surface task forces, ambush enemy capital ships, and conduct reconnaissance in support of major naval operations. This philosophy reflected the decisive battle doctrine that dominated Japanese naval thinking, the belief that the Pacific War would be won through a climactic surface engagement between battleship fleets, similar to the Battle of Tsushima that had destroyed the Russian Navy in 1905. Submarines would soften enemy forces before this decisive engagement, sinking carriers and battleships to ensure Japanese numerical superiority when the Great Battle finally occurred. In the opening months of the Pacific War, Japanese submarines achieved significant successes that seemed to validate this doctrine. They sank the carrier USS Saratoga, forcing it into extended repairs. They damaged the battleship North Carolina. They operated in Hawaiian waters with impunity, shelling shore installations and sinking merchant vessels within sight of Oahu. The submarine I-26 alone sank 7 Allied ships in the first 6 months of the war. Japanese submariners believed they were operating in an environment where their superior technology and training gave them decisive advantages. The Pacific Ocean was vast enough to hide in, deep enough to escape into, and empty enough that encounters with enemy forces occurred on terms favorable to the submarine commander. This confidence persisted through 1942 and into early 1943, even as the strategic situation deteriorated. Japanese submarines continued to score kills against Allied warships and conducted long-range missions that demonstrated their technical capabilities. They supplied isolated garrisons, evacuated personnel from bypassed islands, and conducted reconnaissance operations across the Pacific. But the operational environment was changing in ways that Japanese Naval Command did not fully recognize or could not effectively counter. The Americans were waging a different kind of submarine war. Rather than focusing on enemy warships, American submarines targeted the merchant shipping that supplied Japan's far-flung empire. This unglamorous campaign of commerce raiding proved strategically decisive, slowly strangling Japan's economy by cutting off the raw materials that Japanese industry required. But equally important, though less visible, was the transformation occurring in anti-submarine warfare. The Americans were developing detection technologies, operational procedures, and organizational structures that would make the ocean increasingly transparent and hostile to enemy submarines. The Sonar Buoys that Lieutenant Commander Kusaka encountered in February 1944 represented one element of this technological revolution. The concept was deceptively simple: deploy listening devices across large ocean areas to detect submarine acoustic signatures, then vector surface ships or aircraft toward contacts for attack. But implementation required sophisticated engineering, reliable long-range communications, and the industrial capacity to produce thousands of units. The Americans possessed all three requirements in abundance. The buoys themselves were marvels of miniaturized technology. Each unit contained hydrophones sensitive enough to detect submarine machinery at ranges of several miles, battery power sufficient for continuous operation over weeks or months, and transmitters that could relay detection data to surface vessels or patrol aircraft. Early versions were crude by later standards. They transmitted continuously rather than on command, making them relatively easy for submarines to detect. But they established the principle of persistent area surveillance, creating an electronic curtain through which submarines could not pass undetected. The development of these systems reflected the broader American approach to technological warfare. Identify a problem, mobilize industrial and scientific resources to solve it, then produce solutions in quantities sufficient to deploy them across entire theaters of operation. The National Defense Research Committee, established in 1940, had been funding acoustic research at universities and corporate laboratories even before Pearl Harbor. By 1943, multiple competing sonobuoy designs were undergoing field testing. By early 1944, production models were being deployed in strategically critical areas: the approaches to major bases, the sea lanes used by supply convoys, the waters around island groups that American forces intended to invade. For Japanese submarine commanders like Kusaka, the first encounters with these systems were disorienting and frightening. Japanese naval intelligence had provided no briefings about American sonobuoy deployments. The technology appeared suddenly, without warning, transforming familiar operating areas into hostile territory. Submarine commanders who had grown accustomed to moving freely through the Pacific depths now found themselves detecting strange acoustic signatures that suggested they were being watched, tracked, marked for destruction. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Submarine warfare depends fundamentally on stealth. A submarine's primary defense is concealment. The enemy cannot attack what they cannot find. The ocean's vastness and opacity traditionally provided this concealment, but sonobuoys negated that advantage. They made the ocean transparent, or at least translucent, reducing the submarine's realm of safety from the entire Pacific to whatever spaces remained outside American sensor coverage. Kusaka's experience that February morning was repeated across the Japanese submarine force as 1944 progressed. Commanders reported detecting unexplained acoustic transmissions in areas previously considered safe. Some transmissions appeared to track submarine movements, the signal strength varying in ways that suggested the buoys were detecting and following the submarine's acoustic signature. Other transmissions seemed to trigger almost immediately upon the submarine's entry into a specific area, as if the buoys were sophisticated enough to distinguish submarine sounds from biological or environmental noise. The operational impact was severe. Submarines that detected sonobuoy fields faced an impossible choice: proceed through the sensor field and accept the near certainty of detection, or divert around it and accept delays that might cause them to miss their operational window. Diverting was often impossible because the buoy fields covered such large areas. Japanese submarines attempting to reach the waters around Saipan in May 1944, prior to the American invasion, found their approach routes seeded with acoustic sensors. Several submarines that attempted to penetrate these fields were detected and destroyed by American destroyers and patrol aircraft that responded to buoy alerts. The buoys themselves became objects of intense interest and fear among Japanese submariners. Crews that detected the persistent electronic pulses began referring to them as the American ghosts, invisible presences that haunted the ocean depths. Some submariners developed superstitious behaviors, believing that certain maneuvers or depths would make their submarines invisible to the sensors. Others became paranoid, hearing buoy signals in every unusual sound, convinced that the ocean was completely filled with American detection equipment. This paranoia was not entirely unfounded. American anti-submarine forces were indeed deploying sensors in staggering quantities. A single patrol aircraft could carry dozens of Sonar Buoys, deploying them in patterns designed to create overlapping coverage across hundreds of square miles of ocean. Surface vessels seeded buoy fields along their patrol routes. Submarines laid them in deep water channels that enemy submarines had to transit. By mid-1944, American forces were deploying thousands of Sonar Buoys per month across the Pacific theater. The buoys were part of a larger system of anti-submarine warfare that integrated multiple technologies and operational practices. High-frequency direction-finding equipment allowed American ships to triangulate Japanese submarine radio transmissions. Radar systems could detect surfaced submarines at night, negating the darkness that submarines had traditionally used for battery charging and high-speed transit. Code-breaking operations provided intelligence about submarine deployments and patrol areas. Long-range patrol aircraft could cover vast ocean areas, forcing submarines to remain submerged for extended periods. When all these capabilities worked together, the ocean became a trap rather than a refuge. Japanese submarines attempting to operate in this environment faced escalating attrition rates. In 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 19 submarines to all causes. In 1943, losses increased to 22 boats. But in 1944, the year when Sonar Buoy deployments expanded dramatically, Japanese submarine losses climbed to 55 boats, more than double the previous year. This attrition was unsustainable. The Japanese submarine force had begun the war with approximately 65 first-line boats. By the end of 1944, despite new construction, operational strength had declined to fewer than 40 submarines capable of frontline service. The submariners who survived these operations returned to base with accounts that seemed almost fantastic to crews who had not yet experienced the new American capabilities. They described being hunted by aircraft that appeared overhead within minutes of the submarine reaching periscope depth, as if the Americans somehow knew exactly where to look. They reported depth charge attacks that began immediately upon entering certain sea areas, suggesting that their approach had been detected long before visual or radar contact. They described feeling observed, tracked, hunted, with a persistence that previous anti-submarine efforts had never achieved. Petty Officer Nakamura, the sonar operator on the I-176, who first detected the mysterious transmissions, survived 3 more war patrols before his submarine was sunk in August 1944. He was one of only 7 crew members who escaped the sinking boat and made it to the surface. American destroyers picked up the survivors and transported them to a prisoner of war camp in Hawaii, where interrogators questioned them extensively about Japanese submarine operations and technology. In these interrogations, recorded and later declassified, Nakamura described his psychological state during those final patrols. "We felt like fish swimming in an aquarium, visible from all sides but unable to see who was watching us. Every time we submerged, we listened for the American signals. They were everywhere. Sometimes I would remove my headphones for a few minutes just to escape the sound of them, but my commander would order me to put them back on. We had to know where the sensors were, even though knowing only made us more afraid because we realized we could not avoid them." This testimony captures the psychological warfare dimension of the Sonar Buoy campaign. The buoys were effective as tactical sensors, providing detection data that led to submarine kills. But they were equally effective as psychological weapons, creating an environment of constant anxiety that degraded crew performance and command decision-making. Submarine commanders became conservative, avoiding areas where they detected buoy fields, even when operational necessity demanded they proceed. Some commanders became reckless, convincing themselves that the buoy signals were deceptions or that their submarines could penetrate sensor fields through speed or depth. Both responses, excessive caution and reckless aggression, played into American hands by reducing the effectiveness of Japanese submarine operations. The buoys also served as symbols of American material abundance in ways that mirrored the psychological impact of radar chaff over Germany. Each Sonar Buoy represented sophisticated electronics, precision manufacturing, and integrated systems engineering. They were deployed by the thousands and treated as expendable, dropped into the ocean, used for their operational lifetime, then abandoned when their batteries expired or when advancing operations moved beyond their coverage areas. The casual wastefulness of this approach, from a Japanese perspective, was staggering. Japanese submariners were accustomed to maintaining equipment carefully, repairing systems multiple times, extending service life through meticulous maintenance. The idea of deploying complex electronic devices as single-use items was almost incomprehensible. Yet that was exactly what the Americans did. They produced Sonar Buoys faster than they could deploy them, stockpiling thousands of units at forward bases, treating them as ammunition rather than precision instruments. This approach required an industrial base capable of mass-producing sophisticated electronics while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, tanks, and all the other materiel required for global warfare. Lieutenant Commander Kusaka never had the opportunity to reflect on these implications in a prisoner of war interrogation. The I-176 was detected and sunk by American destroyers on March 17, 1944, just 5 weeks after Kusaka first encountered the Sonar Buoy signals. The attack followed a pattern that would become grimly familiar to Japanese submarines throughout 1944. The I-176 was detected by Sonar Buoys while transiting submerged through the approaches to Truk Lagoon. Patrol aircraft responded to the alert and established contact using magnetic anomaly detection equipment. They called in destroyers, which prosecuted the contact with depth charges and Hedgehog ahead-throwing weapons. The submarine was destroyed with all hands. Kusaka's body was never recovered. His experience was replicated across the Japanese submarine force as American anti-submarine capabilities matured. The I-183 was detected by Sonar Buoys off Saipan and sunk by destroyers in June 1944. The I-32 met the same fate near Guam in July. The I-365 was caught in a Sonar Buoy field near the Philippines in August and destroyed by aircraft-dropped depth charges. The pattern was consistent: detection by acoustic sensors, rapid response by surface or air forces, destruction before the submarine could escape the area. By late 1944, Japanese submarine operations had been effectively suppressed across large areas of the Pacific. American control of sea lanes was so complete that submarines could not interdict supply convoys. The submarines that remained operational were increasingly assigned to supply missions, delivering food and ammunition to isolated garrisons that American forces had bypassed. These missions, known as Tokyo Express runs, were suicide operations. The submarines had to surface near hostile shores to transfer cargo, making them vulnerable to air and surface attack. Dozens of submarines were lost conducting these missions, their sophisticated capabilities wasted on supply runs because the Americans had made offensive submarine operations too costly to sustain. The transformation of the Pacific Ocean from neutral medium to American-controlled territory involved more than just Sonar Buoys. The acoustic sensors were one component of an integrated system that included radar, radio direction finding, code breaking, patrol aircraft, destroyer escort groups, and doctrinal innovations that coordinated all these capabilities. But the Sonar Buoys held symbolic power because they represented the extension of American technological reach into the ocean depths, the final refuge of submarines. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel extended beyond the submarine force. Surface ship crews knew that if American sensors could track submarines through hundreds of meters of seawater, those same systems could certainly track surface vessels. Destroyers and cruisers that once operated with confidence in the vastness of the Pacific now understood that American forces could locate them, track them, and vector strike forces toward them with increasing precision. The ocean that had seemed so large in 1941, so full of spaces to hide and maneuver, had somehow contracted, become smaller, more confining. This psychological contraction of operational space reflected material reality. American forces had established bases across the Pacific: Hawaii, Midway, Guam, Saipan, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. From these bases, patrol aircraft could reach across vast areas, deploying sensors, conducting searches, maintaining surveillance. The ocean was being carved into American-controlled zones where Japanese forces operated only at extreme risk. The spaces available for Japanese operations contracted steadily as American forces advanced westward, island by island, establishing new bases, deploying new sensor fields, claiming new expanses of ocean. Japanese submariners who survived the war and lived into the post-war period often reflected on this transformation with a sense of bitter recognition. They had believed the ocean would always provide sanctuary, that the submarine's ability to submerge would always offer protection. The Americans had proved them wrong through technological innovation backed by industrial capacity. One survivor, Captain Mochitsura Hashimoto, who commanded the I-58 and sank the cruiser USS Indianapolis in July 1945, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We believed the ocean was infinite and neutral, that it would hide us as it had hidden submarines since the beginning of underwater warfare. But the Americans made the ocean finite. They divided it into zones they could watch and control. They filled it with machines that saw what human eyes could not see. By 1944, we were not operating in the ocean, but in an American ocean on terms they dictated." This observation captures the fundamental shift in naval warfare that Sonar Buoys represented. For centuries, naval power had been about controlling the surface of the sea, the ability to move ships and prevent enemy movement. Submarines added a new dimension by allowing forces to operate beneath the surface, theoretically beyond the reach of traditional naval power. But American anti-submarine technology had extended control into the depths, making even the underwater realm accessible to surveillance and attack. The Sonar Buoys that Japanese submariners detected were first-generation systems, crude, compared to the technologies that would emerge in the Cold War decades. But they established principles that would define submarine warfare for generations: persistent area surveillance, integrated sensor networks, rapid response to detections, and the use of expendable sensor systems deployed in large quantities. Every modern anti-submarine warfare system, from SOSUS acoustic arrays to satellite surveillance to autonomous underwater vehicles, descends intellectually from those first Sonar Buoys dropped into Pacific waters in 1943 and 1944. The industrial capacity required to deploy these systems at operationally significant scale exceeded anything the Japanese could match or counter. American factories were producing Sonar Buoys by the thousands per month by mid-1944. Each buoy required precision electronics, reliable waterproof housings, long-life batteries, and sophisticated hydrophone arrays. These were not simple devices, yet they were manufactured in quantities that treated them as consumables. The production lines that built Sonar Buoys also built proximity fuses for anti-aircraft shells, radar systems for destroyers, radio equipment for aircraft, and countless other electronic systems. The American electronics industry had expanded so dramatically during the war that it could support multiple simultaneous programs at scales that would have exhausted any other nation's capacity. Japan, by contrast, struggled to maintain production of basic military equipment. Japanese electronics manufacturing had never approached American scale, even in peacetime. Under the pressures of strategic bombing, resource scarcity, and loss of skilled workers to military service, Japanese electronics production declined throughout the war. The sophisticated fire control systems, radar equipment, and radio gear that Japanese forces required were in perpetual shortage. The idea of building thousands of electronic sensors for one-time deployment in the ocean was simply beyond Japanese industrial capability. This disparity in production capacity created psychological effects that transcended specific tactical situations. Japanese submariners understood intellectually that American industrial output exceeded Japanese production. But confronting the physical evidence, thousands of Sonar Buoys deployed across the Pacific, treating sophisticated electronics as throwaway items, transformed abstract knowledge into visceral comprehension. The Americans were not just numerically superior, they were operating in a different economic universe, one where abundance was so vast that wastefulness became operationally viable. Some Japanese officers recognized this disparity and its strategic implications even while the war continued. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa, who commanded the 6th Fleet Submarine Force, wrote in a report to Naval Headquarters in August 1944, "The enemy possesses material resources that allow them to deploy detection equipment in quantities we cannot counter. They do not merely outnumber us in submarines and anti-submarine vessels. They have transformed the ocean itself into an ally through sensors and communication systems that we cannot replicate or neutralize. This is not a tactical problem that better tactics can solve. It is a strategic problem rooted in industrial capacity, and we lack the resources to address it." This report was one of many that documented the Japanese military's growing awareness that the war was materially unwinnable, but recognition of reality did not translate into changed policy. Japanese forces continued to fight with decreasing effectiveness as American material superiority ground down their capacity to resist. Submarines continued to sortie on missions that had minimal chance of success because surrender or negotiated peace remained unacceptable to military and political leadership. The submariners themselves displayed remarkable courage in circumstances they knew were hopeless. They continued to man their boats, dive into waters they knew were seeded with sensors, conduct attacks, despite overwhelming enemy advantages. The casualty rates among Japanese submarine crews in 1944-45 approached 80%, comparable to the losses experienced by German U-boat crews in the Atlantic. Men volunteered for duty aboard submarines even knowing that survival odds were minimal. This dedication reflected cultural values around duty and honor, but also a kind of fatalistic acceptance that individual survival mattered less than fulfilling one's obligation to comrades and nation. The Sonar Buoy, in this context, became more than just a sensor system. It became a symbol of the inevitable, the physical manifestation of American power that could not be resisted or escaped. When submarine commanders detected those persistent electronic pulses, they were hearing the sound of defeat, the acoustic signature of an enemy whose resources and technology had made traditional submarine warfare obsolete. The bravest tactics, the most skillful seamanship, the most dedicated crews could not overcome the fundamental material imbalance that the Sonar Buoys represented. By early 1945, Japanese submarine operations had been reduced to desperation missions that reflected how completely American anti-submarine warfare had dominated the Pacific. Submarines were converted to carry chitin, manned suicide torpedoes, because conventional torpedo attacks had become too difficult to execute successfully. Other submarines were modified to carry chitin aircraft, for suicide attacks against American bases. These modifications reflected the abandonment of the sophisticated submarine warfare doctrine that Japan had developed in the pre-war years. Unable to conduct effective conventional operations, the submarine force was reduced to delivering suicide weapons, a final admission that technology and tactics had failed against American material superiority. The last Japanese submarine lost in combat was the I-373, sunk by American destroyers near Okinawa on August 14, 1945, the day before Japan's surrender announcement. The submarine was detected by Sonar Buoys while attempting to approach the invasion fleet. Its destruction followed the pattern that had become standard: acoustic detection, rapid response by surface forces, destruction before the submarine could effectively attack or escape. Even in the final hours of the war, the sonobuoy fields continued to perform their function, denying Japanese forces access to American-controlled waters. In the decades after the war, American anti-submarine warfare continued to evolve along the lines established by those early sonobuoy systems. The Cold War with the Soviet Union placed renewed emphasis on tracking enemy submarines, leading to investments in underwater acoustic arrays, advanced sonobuoy designs, and computerized processing systems that could identify submarine signatures from ambient ocean noise. The SOSUS arrays installed across strategic ocean passages represented a direct evolution of the sonobuoy concept: persistent acoustic surveillance extended to its logical extreme, with hydrophones hardwired to shore stations and sophisticated analysis systems capable of tracking submarines across entire ocean basins. Modern anti-submarine warfare has become so sophisticated that submarines operate with the knowledge that they may be tracked continuously from the moment they leave port until they return. The ocean that once provided concealment now offers only varying degrees of transparency. Stealth technology, acoustic quieting, anechoic coatings, advanced propulsion systems, represents submarine forces' attempt to restore some measure of concealment in an environment that technology has made progressively more transparent. But the fundamental principle established in 1944 remains valid. The ocean is not neutral territory, but rather a medium that can be claimed through sensor networks and technological superiority. The sonobuoys deployed in the Pacific during 1944 were primitive compared to modern systems, but they established the psychological framework that still defines submarine warfare. Submarine commanders must assume they are potentially under surveillance, that their movements may be tracked, that the ocean offers incomplete protection. This assumption fundamentally shapes operational planning, tactical decision-making, and strategic thinking about submarine employment. For the Japanese submariners who first encountered these systems, the psychological impact was immediate and devastating because it arrived without warning or preparation. They had operated in an environment where the ocean provided reliable concealment, and suddenly that concealment was stripped away. The sensation was similar to what infantry might experience if fog suddenly lifted during an advance, exposing them to enemy, observation, and fire. But for submariners, there was no weather change, no environmental factor they could identify. The ocean looked the same, felt the same, sounded the same, except for those persistent electronic pulses that announced they were being watched. The recurring sound of the sonobuoy transmissions became the symbolic element that defined this transformation. Unlike radar chaff or captured weapons or other physical evidence of American technology, the sonobuoy signals were purely acoustic, experienced only through hydrophones, invisible and intangible, but undeniably present. Submariners could not see the buoys, could not retrieve them for analysis, could not directly confront them. They could only hear them, pulsing regularly through the water, marking territory, claiming space, announcing American presence in the depths. This acoustic claiming of territory had profound implications for how Japanese submariners understood their operational environment. The ocean had always been defined by sound. The sonar operator's domain was entirely acoustic, interpreting the invisible world through audio information. But traditionally, the sounds had been enemy ships, biological noise, environmental phenomena, all elements that occurred naturally or as byproducts of normal operations. The Sonar Buoy transmissions were different. They were deliberate, designed to be heard, intended to announce presence and establish control. They were acoustic flags, planted in the water to mark American territory. Lieutenant Commander Kusaka, in those final weeks before his death, understood this transformation even if he could not articulate it in these terms. The ocean that he had trained in, that he had learned to navigate by sound and instinct, was being overwritten by American technology. The acoustic landscape was changing, filling with artificial signals that had no natural analog. He was piloting his submarine through a space that was being actively claimed by an enemy whose technological and material resources exceeded anything he could counter. The I-176 made 3 more war patrols after that February morning when Kusaka first detected the mysterious transmissions. On each patrol, the Sonar Buoy fields were more extensive, the signals more numerous, the sense of being observed more pervasive. On the final patrol, departing Truk on March 10, 1944, Kusaka received orders to intercept American supply convoys reported near the Admiralty Islands. The submarine would have to transit through waters that recent intelligence reports indicated were heavily seeded with acoustic sensors. Kusaka briefed his crew before departure. Several survivors from other submarines were present at the briefing, men who had experienced Sonar Buoy detections and subsequent depth charge attacks. They advised extreme caution, proceed at minimal speed, use random course changes, avoid approaching the sensor fields too directly. But the operational imperative remained. The submarine had to reach its patrol area, had to attempt to interdict enemy shipping, had to fulfill its mission despite the dangers. The I-176 submerged off Truk on March 11th and began the transit toward the Admiralty Islands. For 6 days, the submarine proceeded without incident, avoiding areas where Nakamura detected buoy signals. But on March 17th, while transiting through a strait that represented the only practical approach to the operational area, Nakamura detected a dense field of transmissions, dozens of buoys arranged in overlapping patterns that covered the entire passage. Kusaka faced the choice that had confronted so many other submarine commanders: proceed through the sensor field or abort the mission. He chose to proceed, hoping that slow speed and careful navigation might allow the I-176 to penetrate the field without triggering a response. The submarine slowed to 4 knots, barely maintaining steerage, and entered the acoustic gauntlet. They had traveled less than 3 miles into the sensor field when the first depth charges detonated. American destroyers responding to buoy alerts had positioned themselves to intercept any submarine attempting the transit. The depth charges were followed by hedgehog attacks, ahead throwing weapons that created patterns of explosions around the submarine's projected position. The I-176 attempted to evade, diving deeper and turning toward what seemed like a gap in the attack pattern. But the Americans had multiple ships coordinating their attacks, vectored precisely to the submarine's position by the persistent acoustic surveillance. The final attack came at 11:47 on March 17th. A pattern of depth charges bracketed the submarine, the explosion so close that they ruptured the pressure hull in multiple places. The I-176 sank immediately, plunging toward the bottom 400 meters below. There were no survivors. The Sonar Buoys that had detected the submarine continued transmitting, marking the location where the I-176 had died, mechanical heartbeats pulsing through water that was now empty except for debris and the bodies of 71 men. The ocean that Japanese submariners like Kusaka had believed would hide them had instead revealed them. The depth that should have provided safety had become a killing ground. The American technology had not just defeated the submarine, it had transformed the fundamental nature of submarine warfare, making the ocean transparent in ways that negated the submarine's primary defensive advantage. In the years after the war, recovered Japanese documents and survivor testimonies revealed how completely the Sonar Buoy campaign had degraded Japanese submarine operations. By mid-1944, Japanese submarine commanders were avoiding entire ocean areas where buoy deployments were suspected. Some submarines aborted missions rather than risk transiting through sensor fields. Others attempted to operate in waters so distant from American bases that buoy coverage seemed unlikely, even though those areas offered minimal strategic value. The psychological impact of the sensors had created an operational paralysis that was as effective as physical destruction. American naval historians studying these records recognized that the Sonar Buoy campaign represented a case study in how technological innovation could create cascading psychological effects. The sensors themselves had relatively limited capabilities. They could detect submarines at modest ranges in good acoustic conditions when the submarine was operating machinery that created detectable noise. But the psychological impact far exceeded the technical capability because submarine commanders could never be certain when they were being detected. The presence of buoys created uncertainty, and uncertainty created paralysis. This pattern, technological innovation, creating psychological effects that exceed physical capabilities, has recurred throughout military history. But the Sonar Buoy campaign was particularly effective because it targeted submarine operations where stealth and concealment are fundamental requirements. A submarine that believes it might be detected is a submarine that cannot operate effectively. The commander becomes conservative, avoids risks, prioritizes evasion over mission accomplishment. Crew morale deteriorates under the psychological pressure of feeling observed but unable to see the observer. The American military understood and deliberately exploited these psychological dimensions. Sonar buoys were deployed in patterns designed to create the impression of comprehensive coverage even when actual coverage was incomplete. Decoy transmitters were deployed that mimicked sonar buoy signals, creating phantom sensor fields that existed only in the minds of submarine commanders who detected the transmissions. Psychological warfare teams analyzed Japanese submarine behavior patterns and designed deployment patterns to maximize anxiety and uncertainty. This integration of technological capability and psychological warfare represented a sophisticated understanding of how wars are won. The Sonar buoys were effective tactical sensors that enabled successful anti-submarine attacks, but they were equally effective as psychological weapons that degraded enemy effectiveness through fear and uncertainty. The Americans understood that in submarine warfare, where so much depends on the commander's mental state and decision-making, psychological factors can be as decisive as weapons and sensors. The ocean that Japanese submariners experienced in 1944-45 was fundamentally different from the ocean of 1941-42, not because the physical environment had changed, but because American technology had changed what was knowable about submarine movements. The transformation was epistemological, a change in what could be known and how certainty could be established. Before Sonar buoys, submarine commanders could be reasonably confident that if they were submerged and beyond visual range of enemy forces, they were hidden. After Sonar buoys, no such confidence was possible. The submarine might be hidden, or might be under surveillance, or might have been detected hours ago with kill forces already vectoring toward its position. This uncertainty was corrosive to operational effectiveness in ways that exceeded the impact of actual sonar buoy detections. A submarine commander who believes he might be under surveillance cannot make optimal tactical decisions because the optimal decision depends on whether the enemy knows his position. Should he increase speed to reach his patrol area quickly, or maintain slow speed to minimize acoustic signature? Should he attack a target of opportunity, or avoid the attack to preserve concealment? Should he transmit a contact report, or maintain radio silence? Every decision becomes agonizing when the basic question of, "Does the enemy know I'm here?" cannot be answered with confidence. Japanese submariners learned to operate under this uncertainty, but the psychological cost was enormous. Post-war medical records and survivor testimonies documented extraordinarily high rates of stress-related illness among submarine crews in 1944-45. Commanders reported difficulty making decisions, insomnia, psychosomatic symptoms. Sonar operators reported auditory hallucinations, hearing sonar buoy signals even when none were present. Retry us continue. These psychological casualties were as much a product of the Sonar Buoy campaign as the submarines destroyed by depth charges after acoustic detection. The symbolic power of the Sonar Buoy signal, that persistent electronic pulse transmitting through the water, became embedded in the memories of every submariner who survived the war. Decades later, in interviews conducted by naval historians, former Japanese submarine crewmen would describe hearing those signals in their dreams, the mechanical heartbeat that had announced they were being hunted. One survivor, Warrant Officer Yoshi Tanaka, who served aboard 3 different submarines before being reassigned to shore duty in late 1944, described his recurring nightmares. "I would dream that I was back in the sound room, headphones on, listening to the ocean, and I would hear them, the American signals, pulsing regularly, getting louder. In the dream, I would try to remove the headphones, but they were stuck to my head, and the sound kept getting louder until I woke up sweating." This happened for years after the war ended. The sound haunted me because it represented something we could not fight or escape. It was just there, persistent, mechanical, indifferent. This testimony captures how the Sonar Buoy signals functioned as psychological weapons precisely because they were impersonal and persistent. They were not aggressive sounds like depth charges exploding or ships' propellers approaching. They were simply transmissions, broadcasts, beacons marking territory. Their very neutrality made them more disturbing because they suggested the enemy was not actively hunting so much as casually observing, monitoring an ocean they already controlled so completely that aggressive action was almost unnecessary. The material reality behind this psychological effect was the American industrial system that could produce such abundance of sophisticated equipment that casual observation became feasible. Japanese military planners had understood American industrial capacity in abstract terms: production statistics, ship construction rates, aircraft manufacturing numbers, but the Sonar Buoy campaign made that capacity tangible in ways that Japanese forces experienced directly. Every time a submarine detected a buoy field, they were encountering physical evidence of American industrial superiority deployed in the water around them. The contrast with Japanese material constraints was devastating. By 1944, Japanese submarines were operating with degraded equipment, deferred maintenance, and shortages of spare parts. Battery cells that should have been replaced were kept in service beyond their design life. Periscopes with degraded optics continued to be used because replacements were unavailable. Torpedoes were rationed carefully because production could not keep pace with expenditure. Into this environment of scarcity came reports of American sensor systems deployed by the thousands, treated as expendable, scattered across the Pacific with the casual abundance that characterized all American military operations. Japanese submarine commanders read these reports and understood at a visceral level that they were fighting an enemy whose material resources were effectively infinite compared to their own constraints. The war could not be won through superior tactics or greater dedication or tactical brilliance. It could only be won through industrial production and that was a contest Japan had already lost before Pearl Harbor. The Sonar Buoys simply made that loss visible, audible, undeniable. This realization spread through the Japanese submarine force in 1944 like a psychological contagion. Crews that had maintained morale through years of combat began to exhibit signs of collective despair. Experienced commanders became fatalistic, viewing missions as death sentences to be endured rather than operations with realistic chances of success. Junior officers questioned whether continued resistance served any purpose beyond prolonging the inevitable. The submarine force that had entered the war with pride and confidence was being hollowed out psychologically even before American anti-submarine warfare destroyed it physically. The institutional response from Japanese Naval Command was to emphasize spiritual factors over material ones. Orders and briefings stressed fighting spirit, dedication to the Emperor, willingness to sacrifice for the nation. These appeals to ideological commitment were intended to maintain morale in the face of material inferiority, but they rang increasingly hollow to submariners who confronted physical evidence of American superiority every time they encountered a Sonar Buoy field. Spiritual determination could not negate acoustic sensors. Ideological commitment could not make the submarine invisible to hydrophones. The gap between official rhetoric and operational reality created cynicism that further degraded effectiveness. Some commanders recognized this problem and attempted to address it through more practical measures. They emphasized technical countermeasures, slow-speed operations, careful battery management, avoiding areas where buoy deployment was likely. They trained crews to distinguish genuine threats from false alarms, to manage the psychological stress of operating under surveillance. These practical approaches were more effective than ideological appeals, but they could not overcome the fundamental material imbalance. At best, they allowed submarines to survive longer and operate with slightly higher effectiveness. They could not restore the operational freedom that submarines had enjoyed in the early war years. The American forces prosecuting the anti-submarine campaign were largely unaware of the psychological effects they were creating. For American destroyer crews and patrol aircraft pilots, Sonar Buoys were simply tools that made their jobs easier. They deployed the sensors according to established procedures, responded to detection alerts, conducted attacks when submarines were located. The human dimension, the fear and despair being experienced by the Japanese crews they were hunting, was invisible to them. They saw results measured in submarines sunk and attacks prevented, not the psychological dissolution of enemy morale. This asymmetry of awareness was itself significant. Americans could wage psychological warfare without intending to, simply through the routine application of technological and material superiority. Japanese forces experienced profound psychological effects from American operations, while Americans remained largely unaware of the psychological dimension beyond tactical results. This reflected the broader pattern of the Pacific War, where American abundance allowed for effectiveness that transcended conscious intention, while Japanese scarcity forced constant awareness of limitations and constraints. The end came for the Japanese submarine force not through a single decisive engagement, but through cumulative attrition that left too few boats and too few experienced crews to sustain operations. By August 1945, fewer than 30 operational submarines remained from the force of 65 that had entered the war. Most surviving submarines were concentrated in Japanese home waters, preparing for operations against the expected American invasion. When the surrender came, these submarines surfaced and hoisted black flags as required by the surrender terms. American forces boarded them and found boats in various states of disrepair, degraded equipment, minimal supplies, crews in poor physical condition after years of increasingly desperate operations. The Sonar Buoys that had contributed to this destruction continued operating after the surrender, their batteries gradually exhausting over weeks and months until the transmissions finally ceased. Some buoys deployed in deep water channels in early 1945 were still transmitting when Japanese forces surrendered in August. They marked territory that was no longer contested, broadcast into an ocean where no enemy submarines moved. Their signals faded gradually into silence, joining the other mechanical sounds that filled the Pacific, the echoes of war gradually diminishing into memory. In the post-war period, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, former submarine officers struggled to reconcile their wartime experiences with the new reality. They had fought desperately against American technology and been defeated comprehensively. Now they lived in a nation occupied by the same forces that had destroyed their submarines, working to rebuild an economy integrated into an American-led international order. The Sonar Buoys that had hunted them were being replaced by more sophisticated systems, part of a Cold War anti-submarine network directed against the Soviet Union rather than Japan. Some veterans found bitter irony in this reversal. The technological superiority that had defeated them was now being deployed to protect Japan as part of the American alliance system. The ocean that had become American territory during the Pacific War remained American territory afterward, patrolled by the same Navy that had sunk their submarines, monitored by acoustic systems descended from the Sonar Buoys that had first demonstrated the ocean could be claimed through technology. Other veterans drew different lessons. They recognized that Japan's defeat had stemmed from attempting to fight an industrial war with insufficient industrial base. The decision to challenge American power in 1941 had been fundamentally flawed because it ignored the material disparity that would ultimately prove decisive. The Sonar Buoys were simply one manifestation of that disparity, sophisticated electronics deployed in quantities that Japanese industry could never match. The war had been lost before it began, lost in the steel mills and factories and research laboratories that gave America overwhelming material advantages. This understanding shaped post-war Japan's approach to international relations and economic development. Rather than seeking military power, Japan focused on economic growth and technological advancement within the American-led international system. The submarine force that had been destroyed by American technology was not rebuilt. Instead, Japan developed a small, defensive maritime self-defense force equipped largely with American technology and integrated into American strategic planning. The lesson absorbed was that prosperity and security came through cooperation with American power rather than resistance to it. For the individual submariners who survived, the transition to civilian life was often difficult. They carried memories of comrades lost, boats destroyed, missions that had accomplished nothing beyond delaying the inevitable. The sound of the Sonar Buoy transmissions haunted many of them, an acoustic memory that triggered anxiety and fear decades after the war ended. Some veterans avoided the ocean entirely, unable to bear the associations. Others became fishermen or merchant mariners, reclaiming their relationship with the sea through peaceful pursuits. Petty Officer Nakamura, the sonar operator who first detected the strange transmissions on the I-176, survived his submarine sinking only to spend 3 years in a prisoner of war camp. After repatriation to Japan in 1947, he worked as a radio technician in Tokyo, his wartime acoustic training translating into civilian electronic skills. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, but in a 1979 interview conducted for a documentary about the Pacific War, he offered his reflection on the Sonar Buoy campaign. "We thought the ocean was neutral, that it would hide us equally from all sides. But the Americans proved that the ocean, like everything else in war, belongs to whoever has the technology and resources to claim it. They filled the depths with their machines, made the water itself their ally. We were not fighting ships or aircraft, but fighting the ocean itself, transformed into American territory. That is a war no submarine can win." This observation captures the fundamental transformation that sonobuoy technology represented. Naval warfare had always been about controlling surface waters, the ability to move ships and prevent enemy movement. Submarines had added a third dimension, allowing forces to operate beneath the surface, theoretically beyond the reach of traditional naval control. But anti-submarine warfare technology, epitomized by the sonobuoy, extended control into the depths, making even the underwater realm subject to surveillance and domination. The philosophical implications extended beyond military operations into questions about technology, power, and the transformation of space. The ocean had existed for billions of years as a realm beyond human control, its depths unexplored, its vastness unconquerable. Submarines had allowed humans to enter that realm, but not to control it. The ocean remained fundamentally alien, hostile to human presence, neutral in its indifference to human conflicts. Sonobuoys and related technologies began the process of transforming the ocean from neutral space into claimed territory. By deploying sensors that could detect and track submarines, naval powers began to extend their control beyond the surface into the depths. This transformation was incomplete. Vast ocean areas remained unsurveyed and unmonitored. But the principle was established. With sufficient technology and resources, even the ocean depths could become known, mapped controlled spaces, rather than unknowable wilderness. This process of technological claiming has accelerated in the decades since World War II. Modern ocean surveillance includes satellite tracking of surface vessels, acoustic arrays monitoring underwater activity, autonomous vehicles exploring the deepest trenches, communications cables spanning ocean floors. The ocean is being progressively transformed from unknown space into monitored, claimed, controlled territory. The sonobuoys deployed in 1944 were primitive first steps in this transformation, but they established the trajectory that continues today. For the Japanese submariners who experienced this transformation firsthand, the implications were both immediate and abstract. Immediately, the sonobuoys meant they were being hunted with unprecedented effectiveness, that survival odds were declining toward zero. Abstractly, they were witnessing a fundamental change in humanity's relationship with the ocean, the beginning of technological colonization of a realm that had always defied human control. Most submariners focused on the immediate implications because survival demanded it, but some grasped the larger meaning, recognizing they were participating in a historical moment when technology was redefining what was possible. The recurring sound of the sonobuoy transmissions became the acoustic signature of this transformation. That persistent electronic pulse represented human will imposed on the natural world through technology. It announced presence where presence should have been impossible. It created certainty in a realm that had always been characterized by uncertainty and concealment. For Japanese submariners listening to those transmissions through their hydrophones, the sound carried a message more profound than tactical threat. The ocean itself was being conquered, claimed, transformed into human territory through technological means. This acoustic claiming of space had no precedent in human history. Previous territorial claims had been enforced through physical presence, soldiers occupying ground, ships patrolling waters, fortifications marking boundaries. But sonobuoys claimed territory through invisible electromagnetic pulses, through information rather than physical occupation. They announced, "This space is monitored. Movement here will be detected. This territory is claimed not through military presence, but through technological awareness." The psychological impact of this new form of territorial claim was profound, precisely because it was so alien to traditional military experience. Japanese submariners understood fortified harbors, patrolled shipping lanes, blockaded coastlines, all traditional forms of naval control involving physical presence. But sensor fields that claimed territory through electronic surveillance were something new, something that violated intuitive understanding of how space could be controlled. The cognitive dissonance between what submariners expected, an empty ocean providing concealment, and what they experienced, persistent surveillance in apparently empty water, created psychological stress that was cumulative and corrosive. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the psychological damage to submarine crews who had experienced the Sonar Buoy campaign was evident in multiple forms. Medical evaluations of repatriated prisoners of war noted high rates of anxiety disorders, depression, and symptoms consistent with what would later be termed post-traumatic stress disorder. Many survivors reported persistent auditory phenomena, hearing sounds that were not present, detecting phantom sonobuoy signals in ambient noise. These symptoms persisted for years, in some cases for decades, evidence of the profound psychological impact of technological warfare that made the environment itself hostile and threatening. The broader lessons from the Sonar Buoy campaign informed post-war naval development across all major maritime powers. The principle of persistent area surveillance through sensor networks became central to anti-submarine warfare doctrine. The Americans continued developing acoustic sensor systems, deploying increasingly sophisticated hydrophone arrays across strategic ocean passages during the Cold War. The Soviet Union invested heavily in submarine quieting technology to counter acoustic detection, creating an underwater arms race between detection and stealth that continues today. But the psychological dimension, the terror of operating in a surveilled environment, the anxiety of being potentially tracked without knowing it, the stress of making tactical decisions under conditions of radical uncertainty, these aspects received less systematic attention. Military organizations focused on the technical challenge of detection and counterdetection. The human experience of submarine crews operating under these conditions was documented in memoirs and oral histories, but rarely analyzed systematically as a component of operational effectiveness. The Japanese submariners who survived the war carried knowledge about psychological warfare that was often more sophisticated than official military understanding. They had experienced how uncertainty degrades performance, how the mere possibility of detection creates operational paralysis, how psychological pressure accumulates over time in ways that are as destructive as physical attack. This experiential knowledge was largely lost. Some veterans were reluctant to discuss their experiences. Others lacked the conceptual vocabulary to articulate what they had felt. Still others found that military institutions were uninterested in psychological dimensions of warfare. In the final analysis, the Sonar Buoy campaign succeeded not because the technology was particularly sophisticated or the detection capabilities especially reliable, but because it created an environment of uncertainty that Japanese submarine forces could not effectively operate within. The psychological pressure of potential surveillance was as effective as actual detection in degrading Japanese submarine effectiveness. This lesson, that uncertainty can be as operationally significant as physical attack, has been repeatedly rediscovered in subsequent conflicts, but never fully integrated into military doctrine or operational planning. The ocean that Lieutenant Commander Kusaka entered on his final patrol in March 1944 was physically identical to the ocean he had trained in during peacetime. The same water, the same depths, the same acoustic properties. But it had been transformed by American technology into a different kind of space, surveilled, claimed, hostile. That transformation was accomplished with relatively simple equipment deployed in large quantities, backed by industrial capacity that could afford to treat sophisticated electronics as expendable items. The last sound Kusaka heard before the I-176's hull collapsed under the pressure of depth-charge explosions was likely the Sonar Buoy transmissions that had alerted American destroyers to his submarine's presence. That persistent electronic pulse, pulsing through the water with mechanical regularity, was the acoustic signature of American power, not aggressive or threatening in itself, but terrifying in its implications. It announced that the ocean was no longer neutral ground but American territory, claimed through technology and enforced through industrial abundance. In the decades since, the ocean has become progressively more transparent, more thoroughly surveilled, more completely claimed by naval powers possessing the technology to monitor its depths. The Sonar Buoys of 1944 were crude first steps in this process, but they established the principle that would define naval warfare in the modern era. Control of the ocean depends not on the number of ships or the power of weapons, but on the ability to know what is happening beneath the surface, to track movements, to maintain awareness across vast expanses. For those who experienced the transformation firsthand, the lesson was visceral and unforgettable. The ocean would never again be the neutral refuge it had seemed in peacetime. Technology had claimed it, marked it, made it into territory that could be controlled through surveillance rather than physical presence. The Sonar Buoy transmissions that Japanese submariners heard through their hydrophones were the sound of the future, a future where even the deepest ocean would be transparent to those with technology and resources to make it so. The persistent electronic pulse continues today, vastly more sophisticated but fundamentally unchanged in principle. Modern hydrophone arrays monitor every ocean, tracking submarines and ships, listening for acoustic signatures, maintaining surveillance across vast expanses. The ocean that seemed so vast and anonymous in 1941 has been transformed into a surveilled space where movement is monitored and recorded, where concealment is increasingly difficult, where the depths offer diminishing protection from technological awareness. This transformation began in the waters of the Pacific in 1944, announced by the mechanical pulse of Sonar Buoys dropped from American patrol aircraft. Japanese submariners heard that sound and understood, perhaps more clearly than the Americans deploying the sensors, that something fundamental had changed. The ocean was no longer neutral. It belonged to America now, not through conquest or occupation, but through technology that could see into depths that should have been invisible, that could track movement through water that should have concealed it, that could claim territory through information rather than physical presence. The sound echoes still in the memories of those who heard it, in the technology that descended from it, in the ongoing transformation of the ocean from unknown wilderness into surveilled, claimed, controlled space. It is the sound of abundance overwhelming scarcity, technology transforming nature, American power extending into realms that seemed beyond any nation's reach. It is the sound of the future arriving, persistent and mechanical and inescapable, pulsing through dark water where submarines once hid but can hide no longer. It is the acoustic signature of dominance achieved not through superior courage or greater sacrifice, but through industrial capacity so vast that even the ocean depths could be filled with American machines, made into American territory, claimed through technology that Japanese forces could neither match nor counter nor escape.